Hey, hi everyone. As it's already been said, I'm Adam. I work as a technical officer for Devon Biodiversity Records Centre, and I'm here to talk to you today about our Networks for Nature project in Devon. So we're starting with a bit of a background about the project and then talk about how our data is helping create species-friendly highways. So I'm sure nearly all of us have seen roadkill at some point, and I imagine the first thing that many of us think of is hedgehogs, badgers, foxes, and the like. But the truth is that roadkill is a widespread problem across many species. Mammal Society research has shown that, as well as kind of your ground-based species, there's several birds of prey, um, small things like toads and more aquatic species that can be victims of traffic collisions as well. But this is a part of modern life, so why does it matter? Well, for some species, roads can form such a significant barrier to dispersal that the populations actually become separated. When they become separated like this, they can become more vulnerable to catastrophes and prone to extinction. Um, Populations generally have a number of individuals required to remain stable, and dispersing juveniles can be key for smaller populations to stay above this level and to maintain genetic diversity within the population. The bridges and culverts that form kind of a part of our road infrastructure can already be used by some of these species as kind of impromptu crossing points. But sometimes the conditions are unsuitable, or we've installed things that prevent this, and that can force these species onto the roadway where they become roadkill. Sometimes, though, these crossing points can actually just be given simple improvements to benefit a wider range of species. So some examples include installing mammal shelves to culverts, or raising roadside embankments to actually raise bird flight lines above traffic collision levels. And that's where Networks for Nature comes in. So Networks for Nature is a collaborative project between Devon Biodiversity Records Centre, Devon Wildlife Trust, and Animex International to help reconnect populations separated by Devon's major roadways. Animex International are an ecological consultancy who specialize in mitigation within the built environment, in particular green infrastructure. So they were a natural partner to this project. And as part of this, they'll be using the outputs of our work to identify potential crossing points and using their expertise to recommend suitable improvements after ground surveys. And again, in doing so, we aim to reconnect wildlife populations, reduce road mortality, and help kind of stabilize these populations a bit better. And if we're being honest, it's also been an excellent opportunity for DBRC to develop new techniques to make use of our data in aiding nature's recovery. But why, I suppose the first natural question is why use data? Why not just simply upgrade every crossing point and call it a day? Well, besides being prohibitively expensive, there's actually a very high number of structures along our roadways. And which improvements are suitable is going to vary by what that structure is and by the populations around it. There's not particularly much point in spending large amounts of money and time improving connectivity for bats if there's no populations within the vicinity to connect, or if the infrastructure is entirely unsuitable for conversion in the first place. It's far more effective to make targeted improvements where they will be most effective. The hard part is just selecting the right locations to have the highest impact. So how do we go about doing this? Well, the first step in doing so is to have an estimate of where our target species were likely to be. So we started by using the habitat data that the Record Centre holds alongside research into known dispersal distances for our target species in order to map the potential habitat available within the county for each of our target species. We then used our own existing presence-absence record data for these species to score the likelihood that all of our mapped habitats were actually being utilized. And we cut this into three categories being possible, likely, and common based on proximity of existing records and the age of the records. And I should highlight that these maps don't necessarily represent every location where that species is, but it does show where an individual could feasibly be found, even if only briefly, because they're dispersing through it. And once we had these maps, we overlaid them with our roads of interest. And the reason we did this was to find where species were likely to intersect with the roadway. We kept the likelihood ranking system that we'd used in our habitat layer and marked each section of the road with the highest likelihood of interaction by each population. Once these layers had been produced for each of our target species, we passed them over to our partners at Animex, and they compared our road interaction and habitat layers with their information on existing crossing points along the target roadways. They then shortlisted all of the crossing points that intersected with the most number of species and the highest confidence of interaction, and created a shortlist, which was then trimmed down by in-person surveying to examine the potential for wildlife-friendly improvements along these crossing points. And what I have here is just one of the road interaction maps that we produced. You might be surprised to see otters on here. I know they're not often considered, again, as said earlier, the first thing that you might imagine, but they can actually be victims of traffic collisions. This can be either because they're forced up onto the road, either by the waterway being blocked by culvert grating, or because when moving upstream, otters tend to follow the bank rather than swim up against the current. So we considered it to be appropriate to add them as one of the species that we mapped as part of the project. So once we've done these two sections, we've got habitat, and we've got a road interaction, and we've got a list of crossing points. Is that the end of it? Not quite. We decided to take it a step further, and bring in some computer modeling to try and narrow down our shortlist a bit. Now this, as you can imagine, could be quite a technical subject, so I'll touch fairly lightly on it. Fairly early on, we narrowed down our modeling options to two methods, being biodispersal modeling or connectivity modeling. They can be quite similar in some ways, but the essential difference is that biodispersal maps a single species movement, mapping the furthest distance it can travel in any direction within kind of one movement. Circuit modeling treats the landscape like an electrical circuit and maps all the potential routes through the landscape while showing where the routes of lowest resistance are between two or more points. There's pros and cons to both, and we have used biodispersal in previous projects to map preferred routes through a landscape. But after talks in this project, we considered it more suitable to use circuit modeling to get a wider picture of the landscape connectivity between populations. So how did we build this model? Well, DBRC has several decades worth of habitat data within its systems from various projects. Much of this is field level data, but even aerial photograph interpretation data was used because it can still be quite valuable. We combined this with kind of more widely available broad land use data sets and enhanced it with sections of our own data where it was considered higher quality or newer, with the broader land use data acting as a backup where we didn't have information. By enhancing the data in this way, we improve the accuracy of our model as it simulates species movement through the landscape better. So the higher quality data, the kind of smaller scale means that we can more accurately map the landscape and make the model more applicable to reality. But it's not just habitat data that's valuable in this way. We also have species occurrence data to help predict areas where our target species are likely to interact with the roadways and refine our list of potential crossing points again. So to create the layers that we needed for this, we modified the methodology from Finch et al.'s work, which we have a link in the chat for, I believe. And this paper's on mapping functional connectivity of landscapes for great horseshoe bats, which was one of our target species, but was also modifiable for the other 14 in our list. And to build the map for this, we needed data on land use, distance to rivers, distance to roads, street lighting, and distance to linear features, or generally hedgerows, to be produced. Each of these layers needed their own what we call friction values, which marks how difficult it is for the species to move through any particular feature in that landscape. And on screen, we have an image of our distance to roads. So increased proximity to the road raises the resistance score and makes it harder for species to be mapped as moving through that area. Once we have all these layers with their own friction scores, they're combined all together to create a map with a cumulative cost for a species to navigate all the relevant habitats and hazards within the area around the crossing point. And we produced models covering a 5-kilometer radius around each of these crossing points with a resolution of 3 meters to try and build as accurate a connectivity map as possible within our working area. So essentially, each pixel contains all the combined difficulties within a 3-meter plot for every single pixel within that 5-kilometer area. And as part of the project, we did consider trying to produce maps for the entirety of the Devon landscape, but we rapidly realized we couldn't produce models with any meaningful resolution. So the 5-kilometer models that we settled on can produce up to 12 million 3-meter by 3-meter cells of data per crossing point, and those all have to be processed. So you can imagine just the amount of processing power you'd need for a county-wide map of any particular high resolution. So a couple of times I've mentioned the friction scores that we've spoken about. Yeah, the main question you may be thinking is, how do we produce these? And the glib answer is a lot of maths, a lot of maths. We used equations for distance to each of the features, as well as kind of maximum difficulties, which will vary by species. So, for example, your more aquatic species, like your toads and your otters, that tend to prefer staying close to rivers and water features, needed equations to increase the difficulty as they moved further away from all the rivers and aquatic features within our maps. And those, again, needed to be edited for each of our 15 target species to make sure that the model was applicable for each species individually. And on the next slide, I'll use that, we have an example of one of our very early circuitscape maps that we produced for this project. So circuitscape is, once we've got our layers all put together and the friction scores tallied, we run it through circuitscape to actually run the connectivity mapping. This map shows connectivity between two great horseshoe roosts along the A30 and was created as a proof of concept. So further data was added to the model later to improve this, as we were missing lighting data at the time. The orange sections show higher levels of connectivity, the blue lower levels, and the deepest blue being little to no connectivity at all. So it's running between the two roosts, and you can see that it's quite faint along the roadside, but you can see the kind of connectivity following mostly the linear features through the landscape between the two roosts. And as I've said, this model was lacking lighting data at the time, but in reality, the A30 actually has very little lighting compared to major roadways. So it may be closer to the final model than we actually initially thought at the time of running. And we've produced these for the majority of each of our target species for each crossing point. We haven't produced them where it's inappropriate for the crossing point. And by comparing the outputs of these circuitscape models, we're hoping to show which populations are likely to benefit the most from improvements to crossing points. As we've run these once without the crossing point considered and once with the crossing point considered. And basically that involves reducing the friction of roadways in the area of the crossing point and any other hazards that the intervention may reduce to see how much populations are considered to be forced into the area to utilize that crossing point. The project can then use this information to target the work being done to maximize the benefit to as wide a range of species as possible in the most effective areas. So I know that was a lot. So I've simplified our methodology just into about 5 or 6 bullet points just to summarize. So by combining species records and broad habitat data with our own species knowledge, we created a broad map of habitats in Devon, likely occupied by our target species. We then overlaid this over the road network to identify areas of likely interaction with our target species. These road interactions were then passed on to Animex, who proceeded to highlight crossing points within these interaction areas, created a short list of potential sites, which was narrowed down by ground survey, and then they also shortlisted what species they thought these crossing points could be improved for. These were then passed back to us for modeling or for connectivity modeling. With those data sets selected, we created species data sets for each location, that being our friction maps, and ran our connectivity models around each location. Each location is modeled twice, once with the crossing point modeled in and once without, so that you can compare connectivity before and after to see if improving the connectivity will be meaningful for the population. And then by doing that, you can compare the increase in connectivity among all the sites and select the most efficient sites to improve. By seeing which species gain the most connectivity at each crossing point, the type of improvements can also be targeted to best benefit those species. Sorry, my things moved and blocked it. So to kind of summarize the lessons we've learned from our work and from this presentation, major highways are major barriers for wildlife, which can lead to fragmented populations, making them more vulnerable to extinction. We can improve our existing infrastructure rather than having to build new structures to allow wildlife to bypass roads more safely. And data-led modeling using the records and habitat data that record centres naturally hold can be used to highlight the most effective areas for ecological intervention when combined with targeted ground surveys. Because I think it is important to highlight modeling and using our species records is great, but it's always important to combine this with on-the-ground information. You can't just rely on modeling all the time. It's a mistake that can be made a lot in this day and age, and it is important to always have local knowledge as well. But as environmental record centres, we're well placed to generate and collate novel field scale data sets to underpin models like this. And presence absent records can also be highly effective in directing conservation effort and protecting our biodiversity assets. So I've just got some information on Finch's paper that I referenced earlier and a link to the CircuitScape software if anyone's interested to hear about that. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and are there any questions?